Hello, folks, and welcome to The Farm, a podcast dedicated to pop culture, high strangeness, and parapolitics in all its many forms. This is your host, Stephen Snyder. Today's show is firmly in the parapolitical camp. My guest is someone I'm sure longtime readers of my blog and listeners of this podcast are familiar with, but for the uninitiated, he is the author of the Phoenix Program, America's Use of Terror in Vietnam, The Strength of the Wolf, The Secret History of America's War on Drugs, The Strength of the Pack, Personalities, Politics, and Espionage Intrigues That Shaped the DEA, and most recently, the aptly titled The CIA as Organized Crime, How Illegal Operations Corrupt America and the World. Folks, I give you the legend, Douglas Valentine. Douglas, thank you so very much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. I look forward to talking about the drug wars.
No, it's always a fun topic. I just want to say you are an inspiration to me. You have been invaluable in my own research for many years, and certainly in writing my first book, Strange Tales of the Parapolitical. It's just a real honor to have you for this podcast. Thank you so much for coming on today. We're going to go over a lot of topics today. Drugs, of course, and also Nazis, the old China lobby, counterintelligence, and an enigmatic Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent, and probably not the one you're thinking of. But first, I want to talk about one of the strangest companies to appear in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So you briefly mentioned the infamous World Commerce Corporation and the strength of the wolf. This was a kind of commercial intelligence service that featured William Donovan as at one point as a director. Most of the senior staff were former U.S. or British intelligence officers. For years, I've seen the WCC linked to the international drug trade. They sponsored the infamous Poly expedition, which was significant in that regard. Poly is really little understood today, so I was hoping you could maybe go over that for us to start off.
Okay, sure. I mean, I did not actually, do any research into the World Commerce Corporation, but it did pop up in my research into this when I was doing my research on for the strength of the wolf about the old Bureau of Narcotics, which covered the period right after World War II when uh, I believe when the World Commerce Corporation was formed by Bill Donovan, who had been the head of the OSS, and this guy Stevenson, who'd been a big shot in British intelligence, and they were looking for ways to continue to project their power around the world, and because the war was over, they had to sort of do it in a uh, through commercial cover. They couldn't really do it anymore through armies and through fighting war. Uh, they had sort of been, the military didn't want these guys hanging around anymore, and it was before the CIA was formed. So they created this business so that they could conduct intelligence operations around the world under cover of under commercial cover. And this World Commerce Corporation was one of the first manifestations of spies trying to influence events in foreign countries under cover of commercial, under commercial cover.
Have you encountered any additional links to the WCC and the international drug trade since you published Wolf? I know you had briefly mentioned, what was it, Commerce International China in there, which was a subsidiary, I believe.
Um, yeah, that's again, I did not, investigate Commerce International China per se, but it came up in my investigations because it had actually um, uh, been accused at one point of being involved in drug trafficking. And in order to understand all this and why the World Commerce Corporation and then it's the subsidiary Commerce International China are involved in in drug trafficking, you have to, look at the history of the thing. The companies themselves are, just names put on jars up on a shelf. Okay, I mean, it's you could call them anything, but um, obviously after World War II, the United States had pretty much decided that the new enemy was communism and not fascism anymore. Okay, the United States, through its counterintelligence corps in the army, and through some remnants of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was disbanded in 1945, but little fragments of it continued in the State Department and the military. They started recruiting old Nazis into the war against communism, okay, and the war against the Soviet Union and communist China moved to the front and center of American foreign policy. So all these organizations, commercial organizations like World Commerce and Commerce International China, were directed against communism, okay, and either the Soviet Union, which had an influence, most of its influence in Eastern Europe at that time, and into the Middle East, and China, which had no influence outside of its own borders, but was considered a threat into the rest of Southeast Asia. Okay, and in 1945, the United States had been, allied with the Soviet Union in World War II. But it was and in China, fighting the Germans in Europe, and it was allied in China in World War II with the Kuomintang Party, the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, so at the end of World War II, Mao Zedong and the communists pretty much take over China. Okay, and it started in 1945. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government flee to Taiwan, which is was an island that in the South China Sea that had been occupied by Japan for about 50 years. Anyway, the United States started setting up the nationalist Chinese on the island of Taiwan. Okay, this is all ancient history, but it's relevant. Okay,
Oh, absolutely.
China is front and center, and you can't talk about China without calling it Communist China when its actual name is the People's Republic of China, but it's all, the meanings are all disguised in the propaganda of what's going on, and mislabeling things is one of the ways that the United States goes about influencing the thoughts of American people. So they always call it Communist China, even though the real name is the People's Republic of China. Okay, but the battle for control of China continues for 4 years, and the Kuomintang government, the nationalist Chinese government, retreats to Taiwan, and the United States begins operations against mainland China from Taiwan. And by 1947, it's pretty much been predetermined that the communists are going to win. The United States has forces in military advisory groups in Shanghai and scattered throughout mainland China, but really the leadership of the anti-communist forces are on Taiwan, and it remains that way until 1949, when Mao Zedong and the communist Chinese take over the government altogether. And by then, the United States and the nationalist Chinese were firmly in charge of the island of Taiwan, which they renamed Formosa, and they start acting like Chiang Kai-shek has been there forever. But of course, he'd only been there for really 2 or 3 years. And in 1947, the Chinese, with American supervision, the nationalist Chinese, actually start massacring people on the island of Taiwan. Okay, in February 1947, it's called the White Terror. And the nationalist Chinese under Kuomintang, in their bid to take over this island, start slaughtering people. They kill up to 30,000 people in one day, February 28th, 1947. And until 1949, they institute a very fascist, totalitarian government on the island of Taiwan. So that by the time the People's Republic of China is formed in 1949, the United States and the Kuomintang government are firmly entrenched on the island of Taiwan. And it's a fascist dictatorship under the nationalist Chinese. And the United States has to present this series of events to the American people as America and Chiang Kai-shek being the people of the goodness, the forces of goodness and light, and the communist Chinese as the forces of evil, when actually it's not the way it is. So right away, in this period after World War II, the United States gets deeply involved in propagandizing the American people as to what is right and what is wrong and what's good and what's bad, and what the history of the world is. Okay, and there's a tremendous focus on China at this point because it has so many resources and it has so much potential. It's one of the most populated countries in the world, and so it's very important for the United States to strategically try to contain China. All right, which by 1949 is the People's Republic of China. And the base on Taiwan with the Kuomintang becomes the one of the 3 or 4 focal points of the United States operations against the People's Republic of China. And they set up an air force called under the CIA in 1949 called Civil Air Transport. Okay, and Civil Air Transport is a CIA proprietary airplane, and it's based in Taipei in Taiwan, and it flies supplies into Burma and into Thailand and places where the remnants of the nationalist Chinese army are based, and it starts flying supplies to them so that out of Burma and northern Thailand, these armies that the CIA has set up in Burma and Thailand can send expeditionary forces into the People's Republic of China. And all of this has to be kept secret. So it's the beginning of the age of the CIA secrecy in the United States. And this army in Burma of former nationalist Chinese soldiers, okay, it makes its living. The Burmese are a very poor country and they allow it to exist in northern Burma because they just don't have the resources to fight against them, okay? And this army in northern Burma on the southern border of China, which the CIA completely underwrites and supplies from Taiwan through this CIA airline, CAT, Civil Air Transport, supports itself through drug trafficking. Okay, Burma is one of the, it's in this area called the Golden Triangle, and it supports its army by growing opium and selling it on the black market. And the CIA absolutely controls this whole operation because the planes it flies into northern Burma on CAT bring guns and food and stuff from Taiwan, where the nationalist Chinese government is based, and it returns with the drugs on the CAT airplanes. Okay, so right away from the beginning of all the operations to try and destabilize the People's Republic of China, the CIA is basing largely its operations into southern China on the drug trade and control of the drug trade. And so this has to be wrapped in secrecy. And so all the American people can't know that this is going on. And this is what forms the basis of American foreign policy towards China. By the time 1950, but by the time we entered 1950, the American foreign policy is based on keeping the fact that the nationalist Chinese are a fascist dictatorship based in Taiwan, supporting themselves by drug trafficking in Burma and Thailand and Laos and the Golden Triangle area. And so all of American foreign policy towards China is based on disguising this reality. And everything that happens afterwards is passed through a filter so that when it's presented to the American people, it's the right story. And so American people from 1950 until now believe this mythology about what the reality is in Southeast Asia. Okay, and it's all because of the CIA and its covert operations and its involvement in drug trafficking. In and Commerce International Corporation, set up by Donovan and this guy Stevenson, contribute to this, the formation of the advancement of this covert American policy. And for example, in Burma, which had been a British colony, the Stevenson and his British contacts are primary. Okay, and so they are able to help create the police forces in Burma and through their old contacts to have some political influence so that they can help maintain the secrecy. Meanwhile, the United States takes over basically supplying Thailand, where this drama is also unfolding. Okay, the drug trafficking, northern Thailand also becomes a operational place for this Kuomintang nationalist Chinese army. The United States takes over advising the Thailand's army, and it takes over advising, started right after the war, right after World War II, advising its police forces. And so in exchange for giving largesse, technology, training, lots of money to the police forces in Burma and Thailand, World Commerce Corporation helps to entrench American bureaucrats in these countries, who then control police and military, and even politics in those countries to a large extent, so that the politicians, the police, and the military go along with covering up the CIA's involvement in drug trafficking. And corporate, a private company like World Commerce Corporation contributes to that process. And its subsidiary, the Commerce International China, starts doing the same in South Korea, starting in 1950 when the war between North Korea and South Korea begins. Okay, and Korea becomes the flashpoint in 1950. All right, because the North Koreans are supported by China and the South Koreans are supported by the United States. And there's actually a life and death battle in Korea, and American soldiers are sent there and they start dying there. And it becomes, again, there's a tremendous need to propagandize the American public about the nature of the conflict in Korea, and to be able to take over, for the Americans to actually take over all the police, political, and military services in South Korea. And just like World Commerce Corporation helps in Burma and Thailand to solidify American and British control in those countries, Commerce International China helps for America to solidify its political control, its military control, and its police control over matters in South Korea in this epic battle against China and North Korea. Okay, that's a very short history. And once again, narcotics are involved. Okay, I don't know if your audience is aware of it, but Korea is a huge source of opium. I mean, there's a lot of opium that's grown there, and to a large extent, it's the Korean War that solidifies the CIA's control of drug trafficking operations in Southeast Asia. So that by the time the Korean War is over in 1953, all right, and the United States has established it has an occupation government in Japan since 1945, and it's conducting operations against China from Japan. It has an occupation government in the Philippines since the end of World War II. And it has solidified political, military, and police control and a large, control over businesses in Japan and the Philippines. It's now part of the American empire. They have military bases there. And it all is directed against China. So you got this ring forming around China: Burma, Thailand, South Korea, the Philippines, and Japan. And it's all, just trying to destabilize and create problems for the People's Republic of China. And intricately involved in that is drug trafficking in that area. And that becomes very murky. But in order to solidify control over the black market, and a black market is another aspect of any country that the CIA or an occupying country needs to control. The CIA's job is not just controlling the military in these countries that I just mentioned: Burma, Thailand, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and the military forces and the politicians. It also has to control the black market in these countries, because these countries were devastated after World War II. And the black market, just like here in the United States, really can never be totally controlled. So the United States has to, through the CIA, have relations with all the major criminal organizations in all these countries in order to maintain the value of the currency, so that the currency doesn't get devalued through black market trading and stuff like that. And one of the biggest ways of controlling the black market in all these countries is through drug trafficking. Okay, so pretty soon the CIA is involved in manipulating and controlling the entire drug trafficking world through Southeast Asia, from Japan through the Philippines, and including South Vietnam, especially in 1954, when the CIA and the United States take over South Vietnam, which gets partitioned in 1955, the same way Korea did earlier. And now you have a war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and the way that the United States convinces the politicians and the military commanders and the police commanders in South Vietnam to support American policy in South Vietnam is by allowing them to make a fortune in the drug traffic. And the same thing happens in Laos. They bring people over to American policies, which are completely unrelated to the needs of the people in these countries. The poor peasants in South Vietnam are not quite ready yet for the American way. They have their own culture, their own way of doing things, but in order to take control of the country, you have to just completely disregard their needs for land reform, for whatever, okay? And you just have to bring the leaders, install leaders in those countries that are going to promote American policy, which is all anti-communist and all this, focused really on China. And especially in South Vietnam until 1971, when Kissinger and Nixon start making overtures to China. And at that point, the war in South Vietnam is basically over, and the United States sacrifices the nation of South Vietnam and leaves South Vietnam in order to start having economic and political relations with the People's Republic of China. So little companies like Commerce International China in Korea, in South Korea, and earlier Donovan's World Commerce Corporation, they are merely little tiny pawn chess pieces in trying to establish American influence in these countries in the way that I'm trying to explain it to you in 10 minutes. Okay. And you got to see it is that's how they're able to sneak into these countries and through past associations and businesses be able to expand American influence. And also I should add that companies like World Commerce or China International create all the media in the countries that America is occupying. They create the TV stations, they create the newspapers, they hire publishers to publish books, and they can completely control the information that's coming out of these countries so that it's absolutely in line with American objectives. And therefore, this is one of the things that a corporation can do really very well, is to invest money in businesses, in media businesses, that the messaging needs to be controlled. Okay, so meanwhile, back in the United States, the Bureau of Narcotics under a guy named Harry Anslinger, starting in 1949, starts telling everybody. I mean, he's this very prestigious figure who had actually helped to create the OSS and the CIA, and had been around since 1930 as the head of the Bureau of Narcotics, and absolutely controls all of the UN's narcotic policies and stuff like that. Okay, he's able to have his agents testify in Congress at congressional hearings, saying that the People's Republic of China, which is always referred to as Red China or Communist China, not by its proper name, is flooding the United States with opium. Okay, and that there's a communist conspiracy that's sending drugs, opium, heroin, morphine into the United States. And this messaging, which is based on the need to cover up the CIA's involvement, America's central involvement in controlling all the narcotic trafficking throughout Southeast Asia, is part of the cover operation to maintain America's image as the good guy, and not as an imperial nation that's taking over countries and creating the political and social movements in these countries towards America's goal ends, not towards the ends of the peoples in these countries, but actually broadcasting in congressional hearings that are then, repeated by the New York Times, the Washington Post, out in the West Coast by the Los Angeles Times and all the San Francisco newspapers, that China is flooding the United States with opium for psychological warfare purposes in order to corrupt American women. It blames the Negro problem on Chinese opium, coming in, and how liberalism is a result of opium from communist China. Every problem that America is facing is a result of the communist narcotic conspiracy. And this guy, Harry Anslinger, is the architect of this disinformation campaign. And his agents in the Bureau of Narcotics inevitably testify and skew the evidence so that they can tell the congressional committees, their appropriations committees, committees that have to do with public health, that it's communist China that's the problem. And this absolutely corrupts the Bureau of Narcotics. Okay? Everybody knows it's not true, but if all the agents know that if they want to get a promotion, or if they want to get up, work their way up the ladder, and they all consider it fine because America's involved in this existential battle against communism, and they're all true believers. And you can't get a job in the Bureau of Narcotics unless you go along with this, unless you truly believe it. Like Trump, you have to convince yourself. You have to convince yourself that the lies you're telling are true, and then you can convince everybody else. And just like Trump is able to convince all his followers, I mean, he has us 40%, 43% that believe every word he says. Well, the American people believe every word that comes out of these congressional committees about communist China for decades, and that it is responsible for all these drugs coming into the United States. When the opposite is actually true. All right, but the Bureau of Narcotics becomes so corrupted that it's I mean, everybody knows that the war on drugs is just a huge experiment in the political in social control of the American people. And so the people that are, waging these imperial wars overseas and controlling the political and social systems of countries that they, which they have occupied and which they're, are modern day colonies. Well, they're affecting the same policies here on the American people through propaganda and through the manipulation of drugs and the drug business. They're controlling political and social movements here in the United States the same way they do overseas, with the same bullshit, with the same lies, the same deceptions, just like Trump is able to do it with his followers. Okay, or on the other hand, the Democrats are able to do it, influence, their followers, so that people are unquestioning and facts don't matter anymore. All right. Well, this is what happens. And I know you were going to ask me about the China lobby, but the China lobby is is this group that sort of emerges around 1949, and they blame Truman for having lost China, okay, to the communists, and the Republicans use it as a hammer to get Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, elected in 1952. And now it becomes this whole demonizing the People's Republic of China becomes a tool in domestic political politics, okay? And the China lobby moves to the forefront of this. It actually has Democrats who are primary in it, including a bunch of senators. Eastman, who's a big from Georgia, I think he was, and or Mississippi, and they're all Southerners. A guy named oh God, I have a senior moment there. But anyway, there's a bunch of senators. Henry Luce, who's a newspaper publisher. They're all prominent people in the China lobby, and through their influence in Congress, in the Senate, in the House, in governorships around the country, particularly in the evangelical South, they keep hammering away at the People's Republic of China, and it serves their purposes in maintaining apartheid in the South and blaming blacks for their own poverty. And none of this stops changing in the United States until the Civil Rights Movement, which starts burgeoning in the early 60s, and it sort of started seeing the influence of Kennedy and a liberalization and the movements that then happen, the political and social movements that get out of control in the 1960s and start influencing American politics and bringing about the end of the Vietnam War and things like that. But all of that focuses on communist China, Red China. It's a huge piece in the propaganda machine that is used by our rulers to control political and social movements here in the United States, just like they do overseas in the countries that they occupy and control economically and politically and socially. Okay, and that's how the war on drugs fits into, and again, in the 15-minute version, how the war on drugs is used to control political and social movements here in the United States.
Absolutely. And well, also, too, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the China lobby was also funded by drug money in the United States as well, correct?
Well, a lot of these guys, like one of the members of the China lobby was a guy named McCarran, Pat McCarran, and he was the chairman of the Internal Security Committee, which controls internal security for the United States. What kind of information gets presented to the United States public about the covert operations of the CIA, about the FBI, about the military. This is the committee that determines what kind of information is going to be released to the American people about what the military, the CIA, the FBI are doing. Okay. And this guy, Pat McCarran, controlled that committee, the Internal Security Committee, in the 1950s. And he was from Nevada. He was called the gangster senator. This is at the period of time when the mafia is taking over Las Vegas. So a lot of his support comes from gangsters. All right. And he sort of becomes a representation of how the establishment, the political, internal security, national security state is joined at the hip to organize crime in the United States. All right. And he is the one who will, allows for the mafia to take over. And by the mafia, I mean also the Jewish mafia, not just the Italian mafia, but by the 1950s, they're pretty much one and the same, legalized gambling, horse race tracking but mostly gambling, but also as soon as these guys their casinos are protected in Las Vegas, Meyer Lansky, all the mafia bosses, these casinos and hotels become focal points for laundering drug money. This Las Vegas is the place where the mafia, apart from Cuba and some other places in the Bahamas, where American gangsters are laundering their drug money, and it's known to guys like Eastman that this is happening. Okay, but in order to make money and stay in power, they allow it to happen. And the mafia, both the Jewish mafia and the Italian mafia, which are managing the distribution of drugs in the United States, are also joined at the hip with the national security establishment. They're making sure that the drugs go to blacks. They're part of this system. Okay, and in cities like Chicago, or New York City, the political bosses are up to their eyeballs in protecting drug distribution. Okay, and so are the police forces. And it's the same thing today. All right. Just a couple of years ago, I live in Long Meadow, Massachusetts, right next to Springfield, and I was friends with I went to a health club. All right, work out on the arc machine, a treadmill, do some weights and stuff like that. And the janitor I became friends with him. And his father was a retired narcotic detective in the Springfield, Massachusetts Police Department. He was the head of their narcotic division. And this guy, the janitor, is telling me how his father would come home at night and say, well, and Springfield's got a huge Italian citizenry. There's a little downtown, Little Italy, where I get all my, Italian food from. It's 10 minutes away. And how this janitor is telling me how his father, as head of the narcotic division, would let the mafia bring the drugs into Springfield. And these are members of the Genovese family from New York City, or the Patriarca family from Boston. And they would, then the mafia guys who were selling the drugs to the blacks and the Puerto Ricans in Springfield would tell the star narcotic detective who they were selling their drugs to. And then he would go out and he would bust the blacks and the Puerto Ricans. And he would keep, meet his drug quota and keep the blacks and the Puerto Ricans from entering the Little Italy, and the balance, social balance in the city of Springfield was maintained. Okay, which is what citizens wanted. The good Anglo, and to a lesser extent Italian citizens, this is what they want, is the blacks and the Puerto Ricans in the ghettos not bothering their daughters and their sons, and all that kind of stuff. And this happens in every city across the United States. It's the same thing. The local police forces, the local politicians work together with the underworld to make sure that drugs go to the disenfranchised minorities. And the mafia, meanwhile, the mafia boss has one brother who's the priest who runs the Catholic Church in town, and another brother who's the head of the narcotic division. Okay, and this is the way it works in America. It has always worked. All right, and this is just the way it is. But again, you don't hear about it because people don't want you to know about their dark side. So the newspapers don't talk about it, or all the reporters know about it. But if you're a reporter in town and you talk about it, you're in trouble because these people, are involved on personal levels with their businesses and everything, so you just can't do it. You can't put Uncle Charlie or Uncle Joe out of business if you talk about it. So it just never gets talked. So this whole delusional world that Americans live in, with the actual reality being undercover over there, and then the propaganda that we believe in that allows that says, well, we're good people, and we have to go overseas and we have to fight communism overseas because it's godless and it's going to take over our country unless we do it, is what fuels the entire imperial war machine. These same illusions of what's real that distort us and what we think about ourselves and who we are. But it's all these systems for perpetuating this unreality, this world of propaganda that we live in, are very thoroughly and carefully thought out by the people who control us and the people who can create our judicial system and our education system and our political system. Just like segregation was carefully maintained in the South, from the time the Civil War was over by the white politicians down there. It's the same thing happens everywhere around the country all the time. And these are the people who form Trump's legions. They still believe all this stuff about their own innate goodness, their own innate greatness, make America great again. It's just feeding off all these fantasies that have been driven into a certain section of America that believes these myths. And it enables all these systems to perpetuate themselves. And a lot of it has to do with the establishment's incestuous relationship with organized crime, and especially the construction and the exploitation of the war on drugs, and how that affects Americans' feelings about Blacks and Puerto Ricans and Latinos, and how we're able to demonize them and disenfranchise them so that power remains in certain areas, particularly in the white South, which, a demagogue like Trump comes along and is, just able to exploit by pushing all the buttons. And the Republican politicians support this, not because they know that we're actually the good guys, but because it solidifies their control over these systems. the Mitch McConnells and all these guys, I mean, they laugh at Trump, they think he's a doofus. He's an idiot. He's a snake oil salesman taking hydroxy, and drinking Clorox, but they don't care because he knows he's a demagogue who knows how to appeal to their base and to make, to assure them that they are right in all their delusions, and that this is what really makes America great, not compassion, not, caring for other people, but the freedom to take off your mask and go into a store, even if you put everybody else at risk. I mean, it's these delusions of that Americans have about their individual freedom and stuff like that. And all this is intricately connected to the war on drugs, which is what I try to explain in my books, The Strength of the Wolf and the Strength of the Pack, how the war on drugs is used to manipulate political and social movements in the United States, and how these organizations like the Bureau of Narcotics, which I write about in The Strength of the Wolf, are totally corrupted. I mean, they're just totally corrupt by having to maintain this dichotomy between what's really happening and what they would like people to believe, and how this corruption is what eats at the soul of the United States. And you see it in the dissolution of the United States nowadays. As reality starts to fall apart, it's like William Butler Yeats said in that poem: the center can't hold.
Yeah.
The gyre is spinning out of control, and you can see it. And the center is not holding anymore as all these things become known, and the tension increases. It's like you were interested in Gladio, the strategy of tension. That's what you see here. Right now, in the United States, it's the same strategy of tension between right and left, which allows for when there's a crisis like this virus, for the billionaires to make an extra 500 billion, and everybody who's poor to fall further into poverty. It's the same strategy of tension. Don't focus on Gladio in Italy. Focus on the strategy of tension, what's happening right here, right now, because the people, the CIA, the national security state, the politicians, the technocrats who are in charge of maintaining these systems, which they developed overseas, are now applying them here, and very successfully.
Absolutely.
So trying to understand what's relevant nowadays becomes key to understanding how to get out of this mess. Okay? And having a historical understanding of these things is very important. But people like Trump, who understand tweeting, they understand how to destroy history if every day they can get on the headlines. Okay? And so the control of information through modern technology, through the internet, is now the most important system. It's the system that's determining our reality. Okay? The CIA brags that it no longer needs to rely on door kickers, which is an old drug war term. Back in the old days, drug agents would kick down a door without probable cause, because an informant told them that some black guy in Harlem had drugs in his apartment. Okay, and drug agents back in the 50s and 60s referred to themselves as door kickers. Okay, because this is what they would do. They would go through tenements all night long, kicking in doors. And after 9/11, as the war on terror blossomed, and after the drug wars had instituted these sort of door kicking tactics and strategies into modern law enforcement here in the United States, as where our civil rights are eroded, our Fourth Amendment rights to privacy are eroded. The police become militarized, and then they're able to kick in doors everywhere. Well, this goes overseas. And what you see in Iraq and Afghanistan is no longer conventional military tactics. What you see, average guys from Pittsburgh or South Carolina kicking in doors in Iraq of private citizens, kicking in doors in Afghanistan. They're not fighting armies, they're fighting insurgents, they're fighting civilians, and and the CIA refers to them as door kickers. They're door kickers now in all the countries that the United States dominates and seeks to control through police forces and paramilitary forces. Well, the CIA is now bragging that it doesn't have to rely on door kickers anymore. Now it relies on hackers.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
now it's all it needs to do is control what you're seeing on the internet on a daily basis in order to control, can dominate political and social movements in the United States. It doesn't even need to kick in doors anymore. And it brags about it and how it does this now through across the world. Because everybody in the world now has a Mac or an Apple or a desktop. Any place that's important, they're all part of what Guy Debord called the spectacle. So it's a battle, like Alex Jones said, an information war. Of course.
It's ironic you
I
were
don't
just
want
saying that of all
to give him
people.
any credibility, but he seized on that 20 years ago, but it is actually true, and so it's the struggle that the CIA is involved in now, and as represented by Trump, who is the ultimate CIA agent, the fast-talking snake oil salesman, who just knows that every day all he has to do is ramp up the bullshit, and there's half the people believe him. This is how the CIA is controlling our society nowadays. Somehow people have to break out of this because it's so embedded that now people don't even know what's relevant anymore. The civil rights movement isn't relevant anymore. The war on drugs isn't relevant anymore. The Vietnam War isn't relevant anymore, except in their entertainment value and the value that they have in controlling people's beliefs and behaviors. So it's, we've entered a very crazy time. But you can, if you're interested as a listener, understanding how the systems were put in place, one way is by studying the war on drugs, okay, which reflects the way these systems were put in place in its totality in terms of propaganda, police powers, police paramilitary powers, and as the drug war starts expanding overseas in 1970, actually 1968, the Bureau of Narcotics was disbanded. It had 16 agents overseas in 1968. By the end of 1968, it had 1,000.
Wow.
Okay, now the drug wars become the way of projecting American imperial power overseas. It becomes a pretext for taking over Colombia, for taking over Brazil, Bolivia, the cocaine war there, what was called the cocaine coup in 1980. It becomes a way of taking over the Golden Triangle. It becomes a way of projecting American power in Afghanistan. And you can understand how the nature of the American empire starts changing through one examination of its policies in the war on drugs. And you can see how this starts merging into what's called narco-terrorism, terrorism. I mean, today, as we're sitting here talking, an Iranian oil tanker is headed towards Venezuela. Venezuela has the same effect on Donald Trump as Nancy Pelosi. He hears the word, and he immediately, and his brain explodes, and all rational thought disappears. He sees Venezuela and he thinks, why doesn't somebody take the oil? And that's what he wants to do. So Iran is sending a ship today, an oil tanker, to Venezuela. And Trump is focusing the entire United States Navy, to intercept this Iranian tanker as it heads towards Venezuela. And the pretext that he's using is the war on drugs. He's saying that Venezuela is a hub of narco-terrorism. I mean, actually, it's Colombia, which is right next door, but Colombia is an American base for the CIA and its military, and if there's an invasion of Venezuela, it's going to take place from Colombia. But anyway, he's using drug laws as a pretext for the U.S. Navy to stop this Iranian tanker. Okay, so this is why the relevance, not of any particular book about the war on drugs, but for understanding the war on drugs in its totality, in its history, in its evolution, and how it affects justice systems in the United States and how it affects military and covert operations around the world. This is the importance of understanding the war on drugs. It is now providing a pretext for the United States Navy to stop an Iranian tanker based on purely trumped up propaganda, that has absolute, and people believe it. And one of the people that believe it and is explaining it is Joe Biden. Okay, it's not just Trump, but Biden's part of this too, and he says, Biden says that this guy Guaido, or, the pretender to the Venezuelan throne is actually the ruler of Venezuela. Not Maduro, because Maduro is a communist, and we're still fighting communism, which is a way of saying we're fighting humane policies.
Anything that would benefit the workers.
Yes, what are the needs of the people in Venezuela? Well, what were the needs of the people in South Vietnam? What are the needs of the people in South Korea or Thailand? All you have to do is present to the people the lie that somehow these people want to be like you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And because we're great. And people will support wars against these people. Just like they'll support a war, the demonized Red China, communist China. Trump in a minute can demonize China. All he has to do is call it communist China, not the People's Republic of China. And he can keep this strategy of tension against China. He can maintain it on a daily basis. One day they're good, one day they're bad. One day they're good, one day they're bad. Depending on how he feels or what his needs are, because both options are there. It's what you were when in an earlier letter to me, email to me, talking about this strategy of tension. Well, that's what's happening here now. And a snake oil salesman like Trump doesn't have to understand the history. All he has to understand is how to tweet about it, and he can maintain this strategy of tension on a daily basis and be so far out ahead that nobody has time to understand relevance or history.
Absolutely. And I mean, certainly that's a chilling direction that it's putting us in going forward here.
Yeah. And we have here in the United States, over the last 70 years, 75 years since World War II, developed unprecedented expertise, okay, in maintaining these systems that have put this strategy of tension in place today in the United States. And it's basically what created this vast billionaire class who have all the money and all the power. And while the rest of us are at each other's throats, okay? And they're just laughing about it. But there's technocrats and systems in place that have been put in place that are manipulated by a very few people. I mean, it's like a video game for the people in charge. It's that easy. And it was well thought out. And if you read my book, The CIA's Organized Crime, you would learn that how the CIA plays like a controlling factor in how this plays out. And maintains this system in place for the benefit of very few people. And all you need is a movie starring somebody named Jack, or Rambo, and the American people will buy it. You know, and all you need is to tell them that they can have a gun and that they'll be safe, and they'll buy it. You know, they'll be like this CIA hero or this military hero, you know, and it's so dumbed down that people actually believe this shit. Anyway, I've been talking for an hour, and I don't know if I covered all the things that you were thinking about in your emails to me, but I'm getting tired of talking.
Okay. Would you, can I ask you one question right quick about JQ Win? Specifically, I was wondering if you were aware of Major Ralph P. Gannis's allegations that Otto Skorzeny, the infamous Nazi commando, might have been QJ Win in the Skorzeny papers.
Oh, you mean Ralph Gannis' book?
Yes, Ralph
Yeah,
Gannis's
yeah,
book.
I haven't read his book yet, but I was good friends with Ralph, Hank Albarelli. And as a matter of fact, it was me who put Gannis with Hank Albarelli.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Ralph Gannis wrote to me about, now 3 or 4 years ago. He sent me an email and he said, asked me if I would co-author a book with him. He said that he had, for like $30,000, bought a trove of documents about QJ Win in Europe. And the documents needed to be translated. They were in a foreign language. And I asked, well, who are you? You know, how did you get this stuff? And he sent me his military CV, which was like 6 pages long, and said that he wanted me to help him write the book, but about QJ Win and who QJ Win really was. And I was finishing up the CIA as organized crime at the time. So it had to be 4 years ago. And I said, well, if you pay me a certain amount of money, I'll stop working on my book and I'll come down and help you. And he said, well, he had already just spent $30,000 on these documents, which he got in an auction somewhere in Europe. And he didn't have any more money. And I said, well, talk to Hank Albarelli. So he called up Albarelli. And him and Albarelli started to co-author that book, the one that Gannis has just published. Okay, but about 2 years ago, Albarelli and Gannis apparently, according to Hank, had a falling out. All right, about how the direction of the book should go. So Hank split off to do his book, Coup in Dallas, I think it's called.
Yes.
And unfortunately, Hank died a year ago.
Yes.
So he never. I think there was 1 or 2 chapters left to be written. The guy who would know about this is Dick. What's his last name? He does a lot of Kennedy stuff.
Dick Russell. Dick Russell.
Yeah. Dick Russell. He wrote an introduction for Gannis's book, and he wrote an introduction for Albarelli's book. I don't know if it's the same introduction, but Russell would know. He's the guy you should get on to talk about all that stuff. I haven't read Gannis's book. I never got involved with the translating of all these documents he have, which he obviously talks about in his new book, which alleges that Skorzeny, or implies that Skorzeny, was QJ Win, who was a drug trafficker or somebody who was involved in the narcotic underworld, if not actually a trafficker, and worked for the CIA in 1958, worked for both the Bureau of Narcotics and the CIA jointly out of Luxembourg into some sort of narcotic investigation, and then was hired by the CIA. They had what was called a Division D in the Counterintelligence Corps under a guy named Bill Harvey. Might not have been counterintelligence. I can't remember. But Bill Harvey wanted to hire this guy QJ Win to conduct assassinations around the world. Okay, and so he became very famous as somebody who QJ Win might have assassinated Lumumba, been involved in other the CIA had a executive action team that conducted assassinations around the world. And supposedly this guy QJ Win, whether it was Skorzeny or somebody else, was the person who was running these operations, okay, and had a team of people and burglars who could break into places, crack safes, and get documents. I mean, wasn't just um, assassinations. It was, a team of underworld characters who could, commit any crime anywhere on a day's notice around the world. And Gaddis in his book is, I guess, implying that it was Skorzeny. I have no evidence or understanding that it was. I mean, I had always heard it was a guy named Mankel and or somebody else. I mean, there's been a lot of possibilities over the years bandied about who it might be. But it's also alleged that this guy QJ Win might have been involved in the Kennedy assassination.
Okay.
Which is the big $64,000 question. I mean, everybody's always trying to get at that. I'm not a Kennedy researcher, so you would have to ask, somebody who's like Hank Albarelli, who we can't ask, who's really well versed in that stuff, or Dick Russell. Russell would probably know.
All right. One other thing too, I had kind of a question where you were talking. Do you see kind of Cambridge Analytica sort of being like a nexus of what you were describing earlier with sort of this, massive propaganda campaign in the United States and the manipulation of the country through technology, essentially?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that Cambridge Analytic came out of a company, and again,
SCL
so
Group.
much of it, which was formed by British intelligence, the British Secret Services, and used in some African country to destabilize the country and put its own rulers in. Yeah, the SCL Group. Yeah, I mean, it came directly out of British military intelligence, covert operations. It was tested in Africa, and then when it was ready to, for its debut on the world stage, it went to Cambridge Analytical, and it threw the American election.
Yeah,
Did the same thing in America that it had done in this tiny little African nation. So yeah, that's exactly how it works. And there's so many layers of deniability that you can't get anywhere. You can never ever pin anybody down. That if you look at World Commerce Corporation from 1945 and how sophisticated it was and how it really was able to disguise its operations, and nobody's ever learned about them for 75 years. Well, think about how wealthy people are doing it today.
Yes.
Now that the networks are so further advanced and so further entrenched, I mean, there's like no way that anybody can penetrate this anymore. It's like that guy Guy Debord said, the world is dominated by secrecy, foremost as the secret of domination. We don't even know how we're dominated anymore. We know we are, but it's a secret, So, and this will be the last thing I say, that I'm exhausted.
Sorry.
Is that the only way out of this mess is for everybody to start divesting themselves of all their delusions and to start really questioning everything you believe as an individual. And that's just not for me, which I have to do every day. It's everybody who considers themselves woke. I see this guy wearing this T-shirt. It says MAGA, woke individual, W-O-K. And he's got a kid sitting next to him, and the kid is 8 years old, and the kid has a T-shirt that says "I'm woke," because I believe in Trump. I mean, and the kid believes he's woke. And it's just like so pathetic that stupidity has become a virtue. I mean, it's become American greatness has become equivalent with stupidity, mass stupidity. And how do you overcome that? Because the only value and relevance information has anymore is by, in this entertainment culture war. So, every individual's got to try to shake themselves out of this dream.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you so much, sir, for coming on. This has been so just profoundly insightful. Thank you again so much. And yes, hopefully we can have you back on at some point. But anyway, I will be signing off for now, folks. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening. And obviously, I would recommend everybody go out and buy Mr. Valentine's books, all of them immediately. If you've enjoyed my blog over the years, certainly you will find a lot of noteworthy and worthwhile information in all of his works. Douglas, thank you again so much for being back on and or for coming on for the first time. And yeah, next year you guys tune in next week. We'll have some more exciting guests coming up. So
Okay, I'd be delighted to come back. I think this important subject of how the drug wars are used for political and social manipulation is the key to understanding where we're at.
absolutely.
Okay?
Absolutely.
All
Have a
right,
good
bye
night.
bye.
Bye bye. Folks, have a good night and good